Okay, we're going to learn a Maimer, Lehavin, Inyan, Simchat Torah, even though we're now just in the...
There's like two lights behind you that are shining right onto like...
Do you want me to move?
I don't know. Okay, that's maybe.
Is that better? I have two tables, not such a good idea.
Feels like
Yeah, it feels like, for us in Florida, it feels already like the famous story of the Chassid who spent the whole Erev Yom Kippur trying to help rescue somebody who was in prison in a bad situation, and part of it required him drinking, and he came to Simchat Torah, to Yom Kippur completely drunk, and the Rebbe had said that he's already passed with his self-sacrifice. He's already passed Yom Kippur, and he's fast-forwarded already all the way to Simchat Torah. It kind of feels like that, but this Maimer is not just really about Simchat Torah, even though the title is to understand what Simchat Torah is all about, but it addresses all the Yom Tovim of Tishrei. We're right in the middle of it, so we're gonna touch on all of those. This Maimer is significant. You'll see right on the top of the title, it's Motzei Simchat Torah. The Rebbe said this Maimer the evening after Simchat Torah, Bechadroi, in his room in Tafshin Lamed Ches in 1977. So that's that it was not said on Simchat Torah, but it was after Simchat Torah, and that it was in his room, and it was 1977. So the reason for this was because, as we know, the Rebbe suffered a massive heart attack on Shmini Atzeres in 1977, Tafshin Lamed Ches. This year we're marking 40 years from that. It's the 40th anniversary, or Shchedesh Kislev's 40th anniversary from the great miracle of the Rebbe's recovery. So just to recap briefly what had happened at the time, the circumstances surrounding the Maimer were that the Rebbe started Hakafas Shmini Atzeres, the evening of Shmini Atzeres, and it was very lively. The Rebbe was very lively. People were able to detect and notice, at least certainly looking back afterwards, that the Rebbe seemed a little bit more tired than usual. But the Rebbe still led the dancing and the rejoicing and the celebration. And then and the Rebbe went danced for his first hakafa, as was customary, said the Psukim of Ataresa, as he would every year. And then during the next few hakafas, suddenly after in the middle of the fourth hakafa, the Rebbe asked for his chair, and the Rebbe sat down. And people noticed that the Rebbe his complexion had changed completely, and it was very scary. And immediately people started calling for oxygen, for air, and everybody, the shul had been so jam-packed with people, as it was always the case. Simchat Torah was always sort of the climax of Tishrei, and even though there were thousands of guests in town for Tishrei, but Simchat Torah somehow was even fuller in 770. It was jam-packed, and then within a matter of minutes, the whole shul emptied out, and the Rebbe insisted on completing all the hakafas while still in shul, and then he went up to his room, and then we know the whole story of the details. The Rebbe wanted the Rebbe to eat something, they wanted to make kiddush, and did it in the sukkah and on wine. Anyway, what turned out was that the Rebbe had suffered a massive, really life-threatening heart attack, and people at the time obviously were panicked and nervous, but nobody really knew at the time that really the extent of what he was experiencing. Wasn't clear till later with the doctors that, in fact, doctors came to treat the Rebbe. They wanted to take the Rebbe to the hospital. The Rebbe said he wanted to stay in his room, and they said that they didn't want it on their hands, that God forbid he wouldn't survive it. They felt he needed to go to the hospital. That's how serious the situation was. So this was on Shmini Atzeres. What's interesting is that the doctors felt that they had no choice but to take the Rebbe to the hospital, and the Rebbe refused to go. He says he could be treated in his room, and the doctors had decided that the only solution would be to sedate the Rebbe, and then once he's sedated, they can transport him to the hospital. But you need the next of kin to sign off on it. They can't just do it on their own. And the Rebbetzin, who had come to 770, when she was notified of what was going on, they asked her for permission to sedate the Rebbe and then take him. And the Rebbetzin said, "What did he say? What does he want to do?" They said he wants to stay here, but we can't treat him here. We don't want to. And the Rebbetzin said, "Never have I seen my husband not in control of himself. So if he says that he doesn't want to go, I can't consent for you to do that," which was really an act of great faith that the Rebbetzin had, and devotion and hiskashrus really the Rebbetzin had in the Rebbe, that she would have the strength and the courage to be able to make that decision and side with what the Rebbe had said against the wishes of the doctors. And so the doctors, after it became apparent that they weren't taking the Rebbe to the hospital, they all kind of left, and the Rebbe was going through the critical stages of the early parts of that heart attack, or the middle parts of it, almost untreated. And finally, early in the morning, the Rebbetzin asked my grandfather, Rabbi Krinsky, who was one of the Rebbe's secretaries, she said, Rabbi Krinsky, you know so many people, you can't find a doctor for my husband? And at that moment, he thought of Dr. Ira Weiss, who was a young doctor in Chicago, a cardiologist, and so he immediately called his brother-in-law, Rabbi Schusterman, in Chicago, and the phone was ringing off the hook because he didn't have caller ID, and it was Yom Tiv. It was early morning of Shmini Atzeres, and the phone rang enough till he finally realized that it's an emergency. He picked up the phone and he told him what was going on, and they got in touch with Dr. Weiss, who's also a from doctor. And Ira Weiss was on the next flight out of Chicago. He had, I think, a police escort from the airport to 770. But what's interesting was that before he got there, he said talked to his friend, who was another doctor, cardiologist in New York. They got a hold of him, Dr. Tischholz, I believe it was, and he came, started treating the Rebbe, brought some machines from his practice, and they started to, finally, early in the morning, they started to treat the Rebbe. When he came, the first thing he was told, and we discussed about going to the hospital, he was told that the Rebbe said he didn't want to go to the hospital, and the doctors were insisting, and they wanted to take him against his wishes. So Ira Weiss said that he shouldn't, that if he doesn't want to go, they shouldn't. It could be more detrimental if they took him. So here you had a doctor right away confirming and siding with the Rebbe. And then slowly things started to, the long road to recovery. Finally, on Rosh Chodesh Kislev, so about 5 weeks after the heart attack, the Rebbe finally went home. He had been treated in his room for those 5 weeks, and finally, after Rosh Chodesh Kislev, the Rebbe went home, and that day is marked as a day of thanksgiving to Hashem for the great gift and the miracle. And it's staggering to think that after a heart attack, you don't fully regain full function of the heart, and yet, if you think about the output from the Rebbe in those years, from post-heart attack until Chav Zayin Oder, it's just a staggering. It's staggering to think about how active and what went on in those last years after the heart attack. Like we said, the heart attack was Shmini Atzeres, and about 24 hours later, so obviously everybody that was there was everybody was hysterical and was a mess, and there was, Yom Tov was sort of collective mourning. People were sad, people were crying, and nobody knew what to do. Anyway, Matzah Yom Tov, right after Simchat Torah ended, the Rebbe had sent out a message that he's going to speak to the crowd. And he was going to speak to the crowd from his room. So everybody gathered in 770 in the usual way that they would gather at a Fabrengen, downstairs in the big shul. And the Rebbe spoke to the Chassidim via a hookup from his room, and a microphone from his room that was then played on the speakers downstairs in 770. And the doctors had given the Rebbe 5 minutes. They had allotted him 5 minutes to speak. And the Rebbe spoke for 22 minutes. He was sitting up in his bed, and actually the Rebbe said, you see, sort of the seriousness with which the Rebbe took the sichos and the mamorim and the things when he spoke publicly. Right before the sichos, the Rebbe asked his secretary, Rabbi Groner, for the gartel. He didn't hear what the Rebbe said. The Rebbe said again, the gartel. The Rebbe wanted to wear his gartel when he was speaking to the crowd. And over the course of the 22 minutes, the Rebbe spoke, and the Rebbe said a sicha, the Rebbe said a maimer, all sort of mixed into one. It wasn't, but it was clear that the Rebbe was saying a maimer as well, also in the tone, in the style of a sicha. And so obviously that was met with great excitement from everybody. This happened at 12 o'clock at night, Motzei Simchas Torah. And then the Rebbe asked that they write up the sicha and the maimer, and the Rebbe wanted to edit it, which was unusual. Certainly, it was totally out of the ordinary. That the Rebbe would then edit it, laying in his bed in his room during his recovery. The Rebbe would edit the sichas and maimer, and this went on for those few weeks. So there's from Tav Shalom et Ches, post heart attack, you have edited maimer from Bereshis, from Simchas Torah, from Motzei Shabbos Bereshis. This went on every week. The Rebbe spoke after Shabbos. The Rebbe spoke over the microphone to the crowd, and you have a Muga Dikamaim. Last year we learned actually the Maimer from Maim Rabbim. Almost a year ago we learned Maim Rabbim, Tafshalam Ches. The Rebbe said also after Shabbos, Parshas Noach, that was then edited. Lech Lecha Vayira Chayisara, there are Mamorim, they're all edited by the Rebbe. Not only that, the Rebbe also edited the Sichas that are in the series of Likutei Sichas. The Rebbe edited that as well during this period. So while people were trying to unburden the Rebbe and relieve him of any unnecessary or extra work, the Rebbe had requested, and also people should continue to write. As usual, the Rebbe insisted on reading all his mail himself, and also, in addition to delivering Sichas and Mamarim, also edited them and edited the regular weekly Sichas of Likutei Sichas, which wasn't so clear that he was doing it even at that time altogether. So this mimer is the first of that series. The first mimer, the Rebbe said after the heart attack, about just a day afterwards, on Motzei Simchas Torah, Tafshel Lamed Ches Bechadrei in his room. Okay, so let's begin. Lehavin in Simchas Torah to understand the meaning, the significance of Simchas Torah. Simchas Torah is the ninth day. Sukkot is a 7-day holiday. Then is 8th day is Shmini Atzeres, and then outside of Eretz Yisrael we have Simchas Torah, which is the 9th day, the 2nd day of Shmini Atzeres, and that day we complete the cycle of reading the Torah, the annual cycle, and it's a day that is known as a day of great celebration with singing and dancing. So what's the significance of Simchas Torah? So if you do, we know the question that's asked in Chassidus about Simchas Torah, Masha Eifen as Simcha, the Simchas Torah, that the Simchas Torah, the celebration of the Torah, that's the meaning of Simchas Torah. And how do we celebrate the celebration of the Torah? We take a Torah, the Torah scroll, as it is wrapped and tied up in its mantle, in its garment, and we dance with it. So not only do we take a closed Sefer Torah, but what do we do? How do we celebrate? We dance. The celebration is done through dancing. We know that the Torah is called Chachmaschem Ubinaschem, your wisdom and your understanding. So Torah is about wisdom, about knowledge, about understanding, about intellect. Nevertheless, and nevertheless, even though Torah is about study, about understanding, about knowledge, nevertheless, the celebration is performed through dancing, right? So if you look at note 2, when we say that it's tied up, the Torah is tied and closed, note 2, then you can't study it. When it's closed and tied, you can't study it. Befrat, especially the Chazal say in the Gemara, the Dvarim shebiksav, things that are written in the Torah scroll can't be recited by heart. So not only can you not open up a Torah scroll and read it when it's closed, you can't study from when it's closed, but you can't even recite verses that are within the closed Torah because you're not supposed to say it by heart. So the celebration with the Torah, even though the Torah is about knowledge, about understanding, about studying, nevertheless the celebration is something that's not tied with study and with understanding, but it's done in a way that almost prevents you from studying and understanding. It's done through dancing. So you would think that there is great joy and celebration when you study. If you study something, especially you study something deep and complicated, and you understand it, that's great joy. That brings great joy. So that would seem to be an appropriate way to celebrate the Torah, is through an intellectual joy. And yet we celebrate it not through study, but through dancing. And in a manner that sort of precludes study altogether. Now, the fact that Torah is celebrated in this manner of dancing, shalachein as simcha, the simchas Torah, it's kol Yisrael. For that reason, we find that the joy of Simchas Torah is by every Jew. Gam eitzel pshutim b'yoser she'ein shayachim lahasaga v'havana. Also by simple Jews that have no capacity to understand. If they're uneducated and unfamiliar and untrained in the study of Torah, so their understanding of Torah and Torah concepts, certainly the more complicated and complex ones, is limited. And even with them, we find that they also celebrate the celebration of the Torah. Yisayim mizu shebeis hasimcha v'yikudim da'akav zimshachim be'en zugizeugen gam ke'elu shebeshar yimei hashana ein nikar hakesher v'yisachta shalem inyanei HaTorah. Especially, the Rebbe adds here in the brackets that we find that it's not only that simple-minded people that don't understand or aren't big scholars celebrate, but we find more so that it's actually that the joy of the celebration of the Torah actually draws everybody, even those that don't understand. So it's not only that even those that understand can celebrate, but in fact they're drawn to the celebration as well. We find that it's a very interesting thing. I think you saw it in Russia, and you found it in the early days as well, that in Russia, certainly when Jewish observance and practice was banned by the communists, somehow Simchas Torah was a time that everybody came out. Everybody came to shul. Not only did everybody come to shul, but they danced and they celebrated, and the joy was spilled over even into the street, which is a remarkable thing if you think about it, that your Jewish practice and observance, everything had to be done in secret, had to be hidden. Everybody involved was doing it in a way that nobody should know about it, and yet somehow Simchas Torah was the one day a year, even more so than the high holidays, when people were drawn and brought out to the celebration, to celebrating Simchas Torah. And certainly the people that were drawn, that were coming then, were people that were uneducated in Torah, and yet the joy of the Torah pulled them out as well, drew them in. So we find that the joy of Simchas Torah is equal by everybody. The Inyan zeh, this idea, that the joy of the celebration of Torah is not just for the scholars, the people that study Torah, but for everybody. So this idea that everybody celebrates Simchas Torah, the joy of the Torah, we find that it's by everybody. We see that we do it with dancing, with a closed Torah, and it's not done through study, and therefore it can pull in even those people that don't understand, that don't study. But we find that this idea is also celebrated. What do we take if we're talking about Torah as an intellectual property, and we talk about Torah as wisdom? So where do we find the wisdom of Torah? We find it mainly in Torah Sheba'al Peh, in the oral tradition. You would think, a real Torah scholar is somebody who's very fluent and knowledgeable in Gemara and Talmud. So you would think that an appropriate way to celebrate the celebration of Torah would be, you take a Gemara, you dance with the Gemara. But what do we take when we dance Simchas Torah? We don't take any of the other books of the Torah, of the oral tradition. We take a Torah scroll. Torah Shebiksav Dafka, the written Torah. That even somebody who doesn't know doesn't understand what he's saying when he reads from the written Torah, also makes the blessing when he reads from the Torah. The halacha is that if you study Torah, if you open up a Gemara, for instance, or any other book of the oral tradition, and you start studying, but you don't know what you're studying, you're just reading words, and you have no idea what you're saying, you don't understand any of it, so you haven't studied Torah. You haven't fulfilled an obligation of studying Torah. In fact, it's as if you did nothing. It's just a waste of time. It's not called study, and to the extent that you can't even make a blessing before. We know that we're required to make a blessing before studying Torah. Torah is a mitzvah, and so before we study Torah, just like before we engage in any other mitzvah, we recite a blessing before. And the blessing, and we make that blessing in the morning. That applies to the whole day, to the Torah study that follows throughout the day. But if you're going to read a part of Torah and not understand it, then you're not required to make a blessing. In fact, your blessing would be considered a blessing that was made in vain if you made a blessing and then read it and didn't understand what you're saying. The exception to that is Torah Shebiksav, the written Torah. That's why you see people get up in shul, you get called to the Torah for an aliyah, and everybody, without exception, if you get called up to the Torah, you recite a blessing beforehand. Even if you're not reading it, if you don't understand what was just read, but you make a blessing. How do you make that blessing? Because reading from the Torah Shebiksav, from the written law, even without understanding, is considered a mitzvah of studying Torah. So, furthermore, the idea of making a blessing, aside from the fact that it's not made in vain, but as we're going to read in a moment, when we make the blessing signifies an achievement, something that you're doing through performing the mitzvah. That you perform a mitzvah, and before you make a blessing, which is not only acknowledging God and thanking Him for giving us this opportunity to connect with Him, but it also, we achieve something through through performing the mitzvah, and therefore we make the blessing, which represents a drawing of divine energy that's going to come as a result of making the blessing. So let's see what. Let's read it inside. And since the fact that one makes a blessing before reading from Torah Shebiksav, from the written law, even if he's not going to understand it, is something that is an instruction, a command from Torah Emes, from the true Torah of truth. If that's the case, if the Torah of truth tells you that you have to make a blessing before reading Torah Shebiksav, whether you understand it or not, so it means that this is the reality. Even one who doesn't understand what he's saying, that the one who's reading, even though he doesn't understand what he's reading, is drawing the divine energy. The Atzmas Erin Seif, the divine energy, is drawing God, bringing godliness into the world as a result of his reading in the Torah. So if you perform a mitzvah and you don't know what you're doing, you're not performing, or you do it if it's lacking in the performance, in the key ingredients of the performance, and you haven't done anything. If you're going to put on tefillin, but you're just going to strap a rope around your arm, but you're not going to perform with tefillin, then you haven't accomplished anything. Similarly, if you're going to study Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral tradition, you're going to just read without understanding. So you haven't. So it's not that the observance of the mitzvah is lacking. There's no observance of a mitzvah here. If you're supposed to eat matzah on Pesach and instead you eat crackers, you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah at all. You can't make a blessing before doing that because you haven't done the mitzvah, and therefore you haven't accomplished anything in the realm of drawing a divine awareness into the world because you haven't been fulfilling the mitzvah. But when we say Baruch Atah Hashem, so Baruch, the word Baruch, which means blessed, also means to draw. And every time we make a blessing before mitzvah, what are we saying? That we're going to be Baruch, we're going to draw Hashem, we're going to draw godliness into the world. Just as we know that when we perform a mitzvah, we bring light to the world, we bring a divine awareness into the world through the performance of a mitzvah. So when somebody, before he starts to perform a mitzvah, before he starts to read from Torah Shebiksav, makes the blessing and says, Baruch Atah Hashem, it means that by him reading in the Torah, he's about to accomplish something for real, even though he doesn't understand. So we see that Torah Shebiksav, the written law, is not so tied specifically to understanding. It's in a way beyond, above understanding, which that will be significant as we move along. But the point is that we see that we're talking about celebrating Torah, which Torah primarily is about understanding, and yet the way the Torah is celebrated is in a way that's totally disconnected from understanding. It's done with dancing, it's done with a closed Torah, and it's done with the Torah Shebiksav, where the emphasis isn't really on the understanding. And that's why it's something that includes everybody. Everybody's drawn to it. Also, we've another point that's addressed in Chassidus in a number of places is the fact that the celebration happens on Simchas Torah, which is on Shmini Atzeres. In Eretz Yisrael, Simchas Torah is on Shmini Atzeres. It's two in the same. They do it on Shmini Atzeres. Outside of Israel, we do it on the second day of Shmini Atzeres, on Simchas Torah. When would be an appropriate time to celebrate the joy of the Torah? The celebration of Torah would be on the anniversary when the Torah was given, which is Shavuos. So you could say, well, the reason we celebrate on Simchas Torah is because that's when we complete the Torah. So since we're completing it, then there's the joy in completion, in completing the cycle. We finish reading the 5 books. So that's why we celebrate them. But that too then begs the question, if that's the case, then we should have begun the cycle right before Shavuos or right after and finish it on Shavuos. That's when we should have the cycle. The anniversary of that cycle should coincide with Shavuos. Why is it that cycle coincides with Simchas Torah? Why is that the time that we celebrate the completion and the joy of Torah, when Shavuos would seem to be a more appropriate time to celebrate, since that's the anniversary of the giving of the Torah? Okay. Chapter 2. So the explanation is discussed in Chassidus, the Alpima de Isa b'Medrash, based on what we find in the Medrash. The Medrash says that Rabbi Shua ben Levi says in the Medrash that it would be appropriate for Shmini Atzeres to be 50 days after the Chag, after Sukkot. Just as we find Keneged Atzeres Shel Pesach, just as we find with the Atzeres of Pesach. What's the Atzeres of Pesach? Is Shavuos. Shavuos is also called Atzeres. That's one of the names of the holiday. So the Atzeres of Pesach, which is Shavuos, is 50 days after Pesach, and so too Shmini Atzeres would have its rightful place would seem to be 50 days after Sukkot. El Atzeres shel Chag al yidei shein yotzim min hakayitz l'chayrev les b'yemayu d'yizlun v'yesun. Yet since when we're coming from Sukkot takes us into the winter, and in the winter you can't really travel so well. So if a picture of 50 days after Sukkot, you imagine what the roads look like. Certainly back in the day, in temple times, for people to have to come back to the Beis Hamikdash, travel back to Yerushalayim. We know that we delay asking for rain in Israel till after everybody's gone home. All the pilgrims that had come up for Sukkot to the temple, once they're home, that's when we start praying for rain. Why? Because it was dangerous to travel. So imagine having everybody come back 50 days later. It would be very difficult. So since we're going into winter and it's hard to travel, so therefore we make it earlier. The Atzeres of Sukkot is earlier, is 50 days earlier, or it's right at the end of Sukkot. The Medrash continues, this is brings an analogy. There's a king who had many daughters. Some were married to princes and kings and rulers of closer lands, and some others were married off to in faraway lands. One day, one day, all of the daughters came home to see how their father was, the king. So the king said, those who are local, it's possible for them to come and go. But those that are from far away, they can't come and go as easily. So therefore, since they're all here now with me, they're all here together now with me. So Navid Kulan Chad Yomtiv v'nechdi We'll let's make one holiday and we'll celebrate together. Nechdi Iman. Kach Atzeres shel Pesach. So too the Medrash concludes is with regard to Atzeres of Pesach with Shavuos. Ta'ad inun nafkin mechayif l'kayitz, when we're leaving winter and entering summer. So Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu is b'yem l'meisei. God says that it's possible for them to come and go. Aval Atzeres shel Chag. But when we're talking about Shmini Atzeres after Sukkot, Aidei shehin yotzin me'akayitz l'chayrev, by the fact that we're going from summer into winter, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so God says, B'yem l'meizel u'lemeisei ella adi inun hacha navid kulan chad yom tevinechti. Yeah, so since since they don't have the ability to come and go easily, so therefore we're going to make a celebration together. That's the Medrash. So the Rebbe explains, Chassidus explains, the Medrash says they all came together b'chag, right? The Medrash says, right, the Atzeres of Chag. Chag we know is always Sukkot. Sukkot is called the Chag. And then again, the same thing later, he uses the term again, Atzeres shel Chag, Atzeres shel Chag, Shmini Atzeres of Sukkot. But Chassidus says that Chag, it doesn't refer to Sukkot, it actually refers to Yom Kippur. Why? So we'll see in a moment. Let's just keep that in mind. Okay, so let's go. This is why we make Simchas Torah on Shmini Atzeres, even though it should have been later, because that one day, when all the daughters come, which is all the daughters, it's a reference to the Jewish people. The daughters of Zion and Jerusalem, meaning the Jewish people, the Jewish souls. When do they come to see how their father is doing? So that's Koy al Yom HaKippurim. So this explains that we're talking about Yom Kippur. That's the day that everybody comes. That's why the Chassidus understands it from. So the Medrash just says Chag, and it's simply would seem to mean Sukkot. But Chassidus points out that in the mashal, in the metaphor, it says Yom Echad Bo Kulan Lishel Shlem HaMelech Avian. One day, Yom Echad. When we say one day, what's the one day? The one day is Yom Kippur. That's the day that's known as the one day, the Achaz Vashana. So that one day, that's when everybody comes to see the Eibusher. When does everybody show up to Shul? Yom Kippur. So when all the Jewish people come together, Yom Kippur, so therefore the Eibishter says, we'll celebrate together. And when he says afterwards, we're going to make a celebration one day, and we'll celebrate together. So Simchas Torah, Shnikve B'Shmini Atzeres, that's Simchas Torah, which is on Shmini Atzeres, Shu Chad Yom Tov, that's the one Yom Tov, B'Dugmas Hayoim Echad Yom Kippurim. The Chad Yom Tov, we see that Shmini Atzeres is called Chad, that one day that is similar to the one day of Yom Kippur. So we see the similarity between Yom Kippur and Shmini Atzeres, or in our case, we're talking about specifically Simchas Torah, that is the one day. So Shmini Atzeres, Simchas Torah comes in continuation to Yom Kippur. We'll stop here at chapter 3.